Thank you. Okay, so leading off in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 36. So thanks, Chris, for that verse from Jeremiah 29. That was that was a good reminder of how, you know, everything was tying together back then, and there was a knowledge among God's people then why they were there. The ones that were in the know, and the ones that were in the know, of course, were familiar with God's word. And so if I get Daniel chapter 11, verse 36, I'm not going to paraphrase it. I have my paraphrase off to the side so I could explain it, but I'm just going to read this verse and stop there, verse 36 for the moment. It says, "Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished for what has been determined shall be done." Now, understand, we just got rid of Antiochus Epiphanes about a little bit before this. This is an abrupt shift in who the king of the north is now going to be identified as. Up until this point, at least in chapter 11, whenever we were talking about the king of the north, we were talking about the Seleucid kingdom. It's the Syrian region and so forth, where Antiochus III and Antiochus IV and others ruled as, you know, like they were successors to Alexander the Great, okay, or descendants of the successors of Alexander the Great. When we're talking about the kingdom of the south, we're talking about Egypt. Now, that doesn't change at this point. Whenever the kingdom of the south is mentioned, we're still talking about Egypt and the Ptolemies, who also were among the successors of Alexander. But in the north now, when we're talking about the king of the north, there's an abrupt shift here. And there are different theories on this, but I think the most logical one, and the one that I buy into, is that now the king of the north is talking about Rome. Rome is now king of the north. And it's at about that time that Rome is already starting to establish itself. One of the things I don't believe I mentioned last time, when we were talking about some of the Seleucid kings, Antiochus III at one point in time was in cahoots with Hannibal. Hannibal, the famous Carthaginian general who gave Rome everything they could handle in the Second Punic War. This was after Rome had finally defeated him. He became an ally of Antiochus and was like one of his advisors. And he even, I think, got involved in a naval battle at some point in time on behalf of the Syrians and didn't do very well. That wasn't his thing. But what I'm saying is, when Rome had defeated Carthage at the end of the Second Punic War, they had already close to established themselves as the premier world power. And if they hadn't yet, they were going to in the next century or two, for sure, without a doubt. Before the time of Christ, they would definitely be the premier world power. And it fits right into all the prophecies. You know, in the days of these kings, you know, going back to Daniel chapter 2, a new kingdom will be established that shall not be destroyed. So I think all of these things fit together very well. There are other theories about about verse 36 is still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, but if we go through verses 36 through 39, it really doesn't fit the Seleucids anymore. What it fits is the style of the Romans. And I think we're going to see that quite clearly. Okay, now verse 37 says, "He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all." His God is power. That's what he's interested in. And that's personification of whoever's in charge of Rome at that time. It says, "But in their place, he shall honor a God of fortresses." There you go. Power, military might, strength. There was no one stronger than Rome at this point, really. I mean, they might have been able to contend, but Rome was still the ultimate power, and they were even going to get stronger after that. So the God of fortresses, that lets us think of military might. "And a God which his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver." Now, I want you to think back to Daniel chapter 2. And one of the things that sometimes is confusing when you're talking about the great image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, the feet of iron and clay mixed together. The iron is obviously Rome, because the strength of iron was with their mighty empire. But what the iron and clay, they're mingling with the seed of men. Rome had alliances with other groups. There was a mingling there. And this is something the Romans did. They honored various different gods. If they conquered a people and they thought, oh, this people they have a pretty good set of gods, maybe we'll adopt some of them, they would do that. They did whatever they wanted. There were no real rules as far as emperors, what gods they had to honor and worship. They did whatever was convenient for them, whatever would promote their power a little bit more. So I think this is very consistent with the character of Rome. And talks about in verse 39, thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. Okay, so this is, once again, this is a good description of what we're talking about with Rome. Now, as we move on into verse 40, now I'm going to go quickly, but when we get into some of these other verses, it's going to become a little bit more clear what I'm trying to say, I hope. It says in verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Now, this is why it cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes. Egypt never attacked him. He attacked them. And after 168 BC, he was not successful doing that. But here it says, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. In other words, the king of the north is going to dominate this. This was no longer Antiochus Epiphanes. His time had already passed. What was taught, he saw his day in 168 BC, and it was all downhill from there. It wasn't good. And of course, he died not by means of warfare, but by basically natural means. He died of a disease, as was forecasted basically earlier in this book. So this is more likely Rome. I'm almost, well, I won't say 100% certain. I'll say about 99.9% certain that we're talking about Rome here. Now, as far as Rome and Egypt is concerned, this takes us to, I think, Matt, if you want to flash that that next part of the outline up there for me, that might be helpful for us. You can have kind of a visual here, at least in words, what I'm talking about. But in 31 BC, there we go. The Battle of Actium took place right on cue. Okay, so I have my abrupt switch. We didn't reference back to Daniel 2, 40 through 43, but I made mention of that. We just didn't go back and read that about the feet partly of iron and partly of clay that was in reference to Rome. But here, verses 40 through 43, this puts me in mind of the Battle of Actium. Very
all your laundry down, please.
skirmish. What's that? Okay, but a little background. Some of you might have seen the movie, the classic movie Cleopatra, if you've seen that movie with Elizabeth Taylor. That's probably the most well-known among our generation. Anyway, I guess there have been other movies about Cleopatra since, but I remember watching that on television with my parents, at least part of it that they would show on TV. And I remember that vividly. That's why I first learned a little bit about Julius Caesar and so forth. But of course, at the end of Cleopatra, the movie's about her, her life comes to an end because she cannot meet her ambitious goals. See, Cleopatra was very power hungry. She was in cahoots with Julius Caesar. They were an item, and she bore him a son. At least she claimed it was his son. And she was very much into wanting to have power. She promoted Julius Caesar, but then when he was assassinated, she basically fell in with Mark Antony, his leading general. And Mark Antony was madly in love with Cleopatra. He left his wife for her, and they were definitely an item in Egypt. Well, at that time where Mark Antony was carrying on with Cleopatra, back home in Rome, Julius Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, was in charge. Now, at some point in time prior to this, after the death of Julius Caesar, I hope I don't get too long-winded. I probably will, though. But after the death of Julius Caesar, Octavian and Antony were allies, and they went after the murderers. They went after the conspirators. I see Leanne. Did she roll her eyes?
No, she nodded.
She just nodded. Okay. So anyway, but Octavian and Antony, they went after the murderers of Julius Caesar. So they teamed up, and they were successful. They defeated. You probably heard of Brutus and Cassius. In Julius Shakespeare's play, Julius Shakespeare, in William Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, I'm getting my characters mixed up here. The immortal words of Julius Caesar right before he dies is "E tu, Brute." Apparently Brutus stuck the last dagger in him when he was assassinated, and that was supposedly his friend. But Brutus was in on that conspiracy. Well, Antony and Octavian went after the conspirators, and they defeated them at the Battle of Philippi, which took place just a couple of years after Julius Caesar was assassinated. So if you want me to put a date on that, Julius Caesar was murdered in 44 BC. The Battle of Philippi, where Antony and Octavian teamed up against the conspirators, was 42 BC. After that, Antony went to Cleopatra, which in Egypt, because Egypt was already close to being a Roman colony, you might say at that point. Rome had a great interest there because of Egypt's grain, because of their treasures, their wealth. And Rome brought a lot back from Egypt. And part of that was set up between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. But Mark Antony was sent there to oversee Rome's interests. Octavian stayed home and ruled in Rome. So the two of them were ruling different parts of virtual Roman territory at that point in time. But what happened is Cleopatra was extremely ambitious, and she had Mark Antony wrapped around her finger. And that caused friction between Antony and Octavian, because Octavian put Rome first. Antony was leaning towards putting Cleopatra first. And so as a result, now to make a long story short, Antony went to war against Octavian. So it was Romans against Romans. Now, Antony had the Egyptian fleet at his disposal because he was there in Egypt with Cleopatra. And Octavian, of course, had the Roman fleet. So there was a major naval battle, 31 BC at Actium. The Roman navy was not only going to prevail, but Antony would eventually, in defeat, commit suicide. According to legend, Antony's suicide attempt didn't end very quickly. And as he was dying, he was taken before Cleopatra so he could proclaim to her with his dying breath his love for her. That's according to legend. So, and when I tell this story to my students, I always end that with yes, when I say yes. So he could proclaim his love to her with his dying breath. I pause and say, what a sap. But anyway, that's whatever part of that's true. Sometimes, history and fiction get mixed together, but nevertheless, Antony did die as a result of that battle. And what did that mean? Octavian was now the undisputed ruler of Rome. Now, what was Cleopatra's next move? Her next move was to try to get next to Octavian, but he wasn't buying it. And so once all of her hopes were shattered that she could be in a position of power, she too committed suicide. This was later in 31 BC. So this was the end of the dynasty of the Ptolemies in Egypt. She was the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt. So Cleopatra the seventh was the Cleopatra, yes. Very, very intelligent, very resourceful. She spoke, I think, maybe 7 different languages I learned that from the movie. But anyway, she went down because she was very power hungry. And as a result, Rome then took control of Egypt and made Egypt their colony. So this fits right in with verses 40 to 43, what went down. Because Rome took over in Egypt. And in addition to that, they also started taking the treasures of fairly nearby Ethiopia and Libya. And also Palestine came under Roman control. And this is a very interesting story of Palestine coming under Roman control, because this is when Herod was already around and in the picture. Yes, this is the same Herod that would have been in power when Jesus was born.
We're talking 31
So,
BC.
so we're talking 31 BC and after that, getting close to the time of Christ almost. And Herod was an ally of Mark Antony. And he went to Octavian and he basically told him, I would be very valuable to you. Don't think of me as having been a supporter of Mark Antony. Think how loyal I was to him, and now think how loyal I can be to you. And so Octavian was impressed with him, and that's basically how Herod got in power in Judea, in that region. To quote unquote, the king of Judea. So he was authorized by Octavian, yes, the ruler of Rome, to be, quote unquote, king of Judea. Something else that's mentioned in verses 40 to 43 about Edom and Moab and Ammon. They're never really conquered by the Romans. And that's true, they weren't. And so all of this prophecy here, these verses, they can't possibly be talking about Antiochus Epiphanes anymore. That king of the north now has shifted. The new king of the, and this is not the first abrupt shift in this book. There have been shifts from the Persians to Alexander, and from Nebuchadnezzar to the Persians, and so forth. So it's part of the pattern of the book. And also it's been the pattern of the book all along to talk about 4 kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar's, then the Persians, then Alexander's, then the Romans. So it follows the same pattern. But anyway, all of these things, even the little details, they point very much to the Roman, what was just about to become the Roman Empire. See, in 31 BC, it was not an empire, it was the Roman Republic. The Roman Senate still had a lot to say. It wasn't until 27 BC, a few years later, after Octavian consolidated his power even more, where he finally took on the title Imperator or Emperor, Caesar Augustus. So yes, Octavian was his former name. So Caesar Augustus was the ruler formerly known as Octavian in this case. And once again, the other thing, Octavian claimed to be the adopted son of Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar's name still carried a lot of weight in ancient Rome. Julius Caesar himself was never an emperor. He was a dictator and a powerful dictator. But by claiming descendancy from Julius Caesar, that legitimized Octavian's claim, and it gave him more support of the people. He was Caesar's grandnephew. Whether Caesar ever adopted him as his son or not is very questionable and probably unlikely, but he made that claim. So this is the same Caesar Augustus, now Octavian, that sent out the decree for all the world to be counted that we read about in the New Testament of the Bible prior to Jesus being born in Bethlehem. That's why Joseph had to go back to his hometown and register there for the census. This is the guy that made the proclamation. So he was the emperor of Rome starting in 27 BC, and he would rule until his death in 14 AD. So this all sets the stage for the days of these kings that we go all the way back to Daniel chapter 2, talking about when a new kingdom would be established. Of course, it would be a while yet. And Octavian, aka Caesar Augustus, wouldn't be around for the church to be established, but Christ was born during his reign. Okay, I've been wearing you guys out, your ears out probably. So Matt, if you want to pull that down for just a moment, let's see if anybody has any questions or comments, because let's open it up here for a moment. So, and in case I left anything unclear, you can help me clear that up, I hope.
Mike, I just wanted to double check. Mark Antony is Roman, right? He was just in Egypt, supposedly representing Rome's interest.
Yes, he's Roman authority in Egypt. He was Julius Caesar's right hand. That was his leader, most trusted general. And in fact, when Julius Caesar was in Egypt, and like I said, I'm not telling that story. It's a great story, but it's only semi-related, so I'll never get out of that story. But when Julius Caesar was in Egypt, he put Antony in charge in Rome, basically. And that's how much he trusted him. So when Antony was in Egypt, though, I guess after Julius Caesar, then Cleopatra and him picked up where Julius Caesar and Cleopatra left off. So, but he was a powerful and faithful general under Julius Caesar, but his allegiance to Cleopatra was even greater than his allegiance to Rome eventually. And if it wasn't, he sure proved otherwise with what he did. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Anyone else with questions or comments?
Mike, verse 41 refers to the glorious land. What is that referring to?
I believe that's talking about Judea.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Glorious land.
And Palestine earlier, was it?
Yes, that was, yeah, the reference to Herod. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Darren. That's a good question. Okay, and notice verse 42, we didn't read that, but it says, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries in the land of Egypt, shall not escape. They didn't. They became a Roman colony, period. Rome controlled them and many other areas as well. Verse 43, I think we alluded to. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. you know, when the Israelites left Egypt, they pretty much had plundered the country, and it was, you know, not much of a power at that point in time. How many years have passed to this point now where we're talking, and was it indeed enough time for the country to be built back up to be powerful and wealthy?
Well, let me answer it this way, Bruce. Egypt didn't quite recover from the Exodus situation, but Alexander's conquests actually made them stronger, because Alexandria, Egypt was the hub of the Hellenistic world. It was like a city. There were like 500,000 people living there at one point in time. It was the hub of the Greek culture, and it was rebuilt thanks to Alexander's conquests. And the wealth and the splendor of Alexandria was what Egypt relied on. And of course, the Nile River was still, you know, quite a gem for them. I mean, that's their source of life and so forth. But these rulers, these Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt, of course, they were very wealthy and powerful, but they were descendants of Alexander. So they were set up because of the Greeks and the Macedonians. So the Egyptian culture wasn't really so much Egyptian anymore. It was more Hellenistic culture, the Egyptians. So yes, they were wealthy and powerful again. And because of that wealth and power, and because they were one branch of Alexander's former empire, they were formidable, but not to match up with Rome at this time. And most other places weren't either. So I hope that answers your question.
Wouldn't that have been like 1400 years before?
Yeah, about. So, or I'm thinking it sticks in my mind around 1800 BC. Was that the Exodus, somewhere around there?
I looked it up. 14.
Oh, was
There's
it 14?
different dates
Okay.
on it. But
Okay, but the thing is, Alexander's conquests were in the 4th century BC. So we're looking at by between 331 and 323. That's when Alexander made most of his conquests. That's when Egypt would have fallen to him. And like I said, he founded 14 different Alexandrias, but the one in Egypt was foremost of all of them. And it was even more splendid than the Greek and Macedonian cities from his homeland eventually. So it was because of what he did, a power again in that regard.
Okay.
Did that answer your question, Bruce? Or
Yeah, was good.
okay. Now there were, you know, in the Egyptian army, there were a lot of, basically, you might as well say Greeks and Macedonians, because Ptolemy, the original Ptolemy that first took power in Egypt after Alexander, was a half brother of Alexander the Great, Ptolemy Lagus. And so, I mean, once again, they were more a center of Greek culture than Athens was probably at this point in time, and more wealthy and powerful than the city of Athens at this time. But Rome was going to change that. They were going to make them a colony. Okay, so it all centered around Alexandria, which was a port city also. Okay, all right, moving on. Okay, this next verse is something that also puts me very much in mind of the Romans. I mean, this is vivid in my mind. Verse 44 says, "But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many." This fits Rome perfectly in multiple ways. Okay, the east and the north. Okay, let's start with the north. One of the biggest thorns in the side of the Roman Empire were the Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes were very barbaric. They didn't fight the right way. They didn't fight civilly. They were a little different. They were crazy. They were out of their mind. They were, in fact, some of the Germanic tribes, one in particular, the Celts, also known as the Gauls, they used to go into battle naked to intimidate the enemy. They literally, I mean, they were nuts. And they would scare the enemy before. So they didn't do things the way traditionally and conventionally. So now, not all the Germanic tribes did this, But let me give you a thumbnail sketch of the Germanic tribes. They preferred the double-bladed axe as their weapon of choice. They were very good at close-in fighting. And they weren't that disciplined. They were the kind of fighters in general, and this goes back to the Gauls because Julius Caesar conquered that group. The Gauls were prominent in what's now France. The Gauls were also known as the Celts. We would, like, if we said it right, the NBA franchise would be the Boston Celtics, but it's the Celtics, well, we say Celts, but it was the Celts. They were a Germanic tribe and they were fierce. And in fact, they fought against the Romans as allies of Hannibal, even going back to the Punic Wars. But these Germanic tribes, like the Ostrogoths, which means the East Goths, and the Visigoths, which were the West Goths, and the Vandals, who were known for their wanton destruction, and various others, Angles and Saxons and Utes. Anyway, there were tons of these Germanic tribes, and they were all very uncivilized and barbaric, especially next to the Romans. Now, the Romans fought very disciplined in their ranks and files, and they were very well trained, and they were courageous soldiers with much valor. But when they tangled with some of these Germanic tribes, it didn't always turn out well. They never were able to conquer them. The only presence Rome really had among anybody that we would consider Germanic, they did conquer the British Isles, and that started with Julius Caesar, and then it continued with another Roman emperor, Claudius, who I believe was, let's see, I got to think of the date. I think he was right after Tiberius or Nero. He was in a little bit, maybe mid 1st century AD. But they had very little luck with the other Germanic tribes. They did what they could to stay away from them, and they didn't even want them inside their empire because they were crazy and wild. Now, these Germanic tribes played a major role in the downfall of Rome eventually, because during the time of Attila the Hun, and we're going to fast forward a little bit to about the 5th century AD, these Germanic tribes were driven into the Roman Empire by the Huns because the Huns were crazier than they were. And these Germanic tribesmen, they actually did a lot to take down Rome because they were forced inside the Roman Empire. They were mistreated and they were constantly rebelling. So they were a perpetual thorn to the Romans. So when he talks about those from the north that were giving these Romans trouble, he's talking about the Germanic tribes. And I can give you some more examples of that here momentarily. I'm going to shift for a moment before I get into this other related secular history that I listed there for you. So when it talks about those from the north, it's definitely, in my mind, talking about the Germanic tribes because they were a constant thorn in the side of the Romans. Now, meanwhile, when it talks about the east, this too is very obvious. The Parthians were constantly a thorn in the side of the Romans as well. They never conquered them. The Parthians were in the region which we now would refer to as Iran, in that region there east of the empire. The Roman Empire stretched across Europe into modern day Turkey, where Constantinople is. In fact, that became the eastern hub of the Roman Empire at one time. But beyond that, the people there, beyond Constantinople and so forth, the Parthians were absolutely fierce. The one place the Roman soldier never wanted to be sent was the Parthian front. They dreaded going there. One of the most famous Romans of the 1st century BC, Marcus Crassus, maybe it wasn't Marcus, Crassus, he bankrolled Julius Caesar. He was part of a 3-pronged dictatorship that existed in Rome with Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and and Crassus. That was called the First Triumvirate. That he died fighting against the Parthians. And so even in the time of Julius Caesar, they just couldn't conquer that bunch. So the Parthian front was and maybe some of you will, if you don't remember this, from your World War II history, maybe if you watched old Hogan's Heroes reruns, you remember where the Germans never wanted to go? To the Russian front. That was the one place you didn't want to get sent to, the Russian front. Well, for the Romans, that was the Parthian front that they didn't want to get sent to. So these two groups were always a pain to the Romans. In fact, in some of Revelation as well, when it talks about the kings from the east, I believe that's also a reference to the Parthians in regard to Rome eventually going down. So that's a lot of information about part of a verse, isn't it? Okay, so if we look at this other related history, you guys feel free if you have questions or comments. I told you we weren't going to finish up tonight. Does anybody have any questions or comments on anything I've talked about from verse 44 so far? Okay, I have a smattering of battles here and incidents where Rome was entangled directly with Germanic tribes. Now, if you go where I have verse 45 listed there on the outline, the Pax Romana, that's something I think significant to refer to for our purposes. It refers to the Roman peace. And that was a period of time from starting with the reign of Augustus, Caesar Augustus, AKA Octavian, until about 180 AD. It went from the reign of Caesar Augustus to the reign of Marcus Aurelius. That was about a 200-year period where there were no major conflicts anywhere in the Roman Empire. Now you think about how strong Rome was if they could keep peace for that long inside that vast empire they controlled. And it stretched from Egypt to Western Europe to Eastern Europe and into the Middle East as well. I mean, that was a vast empire. So the Pax Romana is very impressive historically because, you say it takes a strong nation to keep peace. They did. But the major exception to the Pax Romana happened in 9 AD at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. 3 Roman legions were virtually obliterated by a Germanic ruler named Arminius. Arminius is German for Herman. So that was, his name would have been Herman. So I always say Herman the German. But anyway, Arminius was a former Roman soldier, not a Roman, but what the Romans did as they expanded their empire, they started incorporating a lot of foreign troops into their army as mercenaries. And a lot of these Germanic troops, they just wanted to fight. They didn't care who it was for as long as they got paid and as long as there was action, because that's all they were in it for. Well, some of these Germanic troops that had been trained in the Roman army eventually turned on Rome, and he was one of those. And so Teutoburg Forest was a very heavily wooded region. These 3 legions of Roman soldiers went in there and they never came out. They were obliterated. Why? Because it didn't match up with their style of fighting. Yes, they were fierce and brave, these Roman soldiers, but in that close in a woods, they couldn't maneuver like they were used to. One of their great strengths was their teamwork. It just didn't work in the forest, in the woods. So they were just massacred. And the remains of them that were found, I guess, sickened some of the Roman soldiers that figured out what had happened. So this was, after that, the Romans pretty much, they didn't want to cross over the Rhine River after that. The Rhine was like the border between the Germanic tribes and Rome. That was a Roman border, the Rhine River. They didn't want to cross over it after that. So that was like, don't go there. Okay. So that was the lone exception, the lone major exception to the Pax Romana. And it was the Germanic tribes obliterating 3 Roman legions. And we're talking legions, we're talking about groups of 5,000 to 6,000 men. So we're talking around 15,000-ish soldiers that got killed at this battle. Okay, so once again, I think that's very consistent with the North, those giving trouble to this group who we're talking about, who was the Romans. Okay, these other things are going to come much later, and these other things are going to come well after the book of Revelation was written, and I think they're probably better topics to relate to that. But so I'm going to talk about them more briefly, I promise. The Battle of Adrianople, some historians believe, was actually the end of the Roman Empire, because they lost that battle in such a big way. It's like they were just wiped out by a Visigoth leader at that time. The Roman general Varus didn't wait for his reinforcements, and it didn't pay off very much. This was a total beatdown, and it's like the Roman army had never experienced before. So this was actually the beginning of the end. A lot of historians said Rome was never the same after that. They were never quite the power they once were. Now, they were still around for a while, but in 410 AD, a Germanic chieftain, a Visigoth chieftain by the name of Alaric, led a group that captured Rome, burned the city, and ransomed off the Emperor Honorius for his weight in gold. Now, if that's not a sign that the Roman Empire is on the decline, I don't know what is. So you march into the capital, you kidnap the emperor, and then you ransom him off for his weight in gold and burn everything. That's pretty, and some historians said that's the end of the Roman Empire for sure. If it wasn't Adrianople, it was that. All right, I got one more for you. Okay, if that wasn't the end, and eventually the capital had been moved, the Roman capital had been moved to the city of Ravenna, Italy at this point. But in 476 AD, another Germanic chieftain, Odoacer, basically murdered the Roman emperor and sat on the throne. So you had a Germanic ruler on the throne of Rome. And if that wasn't the end, I don't know what was. Okay, so if that wasn't. So Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain, he murdered Romulus Augustus. He was the last emperor of Rome in 476. So here's the bottom line. Rome was going to fall. And where exactly you say that fall occurred, it depends on which historian you listen to, but any one of these three would do. But Rome at that point in time was done. It was ancient history, no pun intended. Well, definitely intended actually. And what was left of Rome was the city of Constantinople, which was the eastern capital. Rome itself, that mighty city in Italy, it was gone. And if I'm not going into all the Revelation references, but there are quite a few talk about that city that people mourned over and it was gone. Alas, alas, that great city, the Babylon the Great has fallen. Well, this another biblical book, but I think this ties in very well there. So this fall of Rome. Okay, so the Germanic tribes played a major role. There's more I can tell you, but let's move on. So any questions or comments?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This might be an invalid question because it involves a movie. So, I mean, when you talked about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest,
it
made me think of that first scene in Gladiator where the Romans were fighting the Germanic tribes and they launched all that fire and stuff and they destroyed the forest. And it almost sounds like that was like maybe a reaction to having been defeated in the past or something, or was that just completely fictitious?
Okay, well, here, from what I know about the movie Gladiator, it supposedly takes place during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, whose reign ended in 180 AD. So this would have been long after Teutoburg Forest, nearly 2 centuries. So that's the only reference I know, because I know Marcus Aurelius' name was brought up in that movie. So that's the only way I can put that in some kind of historical context, exactly when that took place. So that would have been long after Teutoburg Forest. But the Romans had problems with these Germanic tribes for quite some time. This was the tail end during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. This was the tail end of the Pax Romana. So after that, there were going to be leaks all over. There was going to be, and the Romans were going to have to put out a lot of different fires, proverbially speaking, in their empire after that.
So I remember they made some kind of comment at that battle that people need to know when they're defeated or something like that. And they were talking about the Germanic tribes.
And they wouldn't have. They were absolutely fierce. In fact, when you learn about the Germanic tribes in general, just the way they lived was incredible. That and they had very distinct roles for men and women. And here's what the men did: their job was to hunt, fish, and fight. That's what they did. Everything else was left up to the women. Everything. Yeah.
What's
Some of you probably must know what's changed. I don't hunt though, or fish. I'm always in
Other
a
recreation.
in fact, I
just have
don't
other
get in that many
games.
fights. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I have other hobbies, but okay. But any other questions about anything we've talked about up to this point?
To me, it's just amazing to look at the time of the Pax Romana and look at the establishment of the church. And, we've talked about that before, but, the roads and the language and everything was just there at the right time. And, God's timing is always perfect.
That's true. The Pax Romana made it very possible to spread the gospel. The Roman roads were extremely well kept and well guarded. Travel was as safe as it ever could be in ancient times. Now, remember, we read about the road to Jericho and, the Good Samaritan. There's a reason, that wasn't a very safe place. And I know Brendan Bruce, you've seen that up close, the road to Jericho. That wasn't a very safe place to travel. But during the times of the Roman Empire, travel was as safe as it could be in ancient times, because they had they had fortresses and garrisons and checkpoints set up all along, the various roads. The Appian Way stretched far across Europe, and it made it very convenient in ancient times to spread the gospel. That, and if we go back to the conquest of Alexander the Great, which literally spread the Hellenistic culture, the Greek language especially, that opened things up for the spreading of the gospel also, because we know that the original New Testament was written in, I believe, the Koine Greek language. And that meant when it was distributed, most people throughout the known world understood that. That was the language of scholars when the Roman Empire was in its heyday, even though Latin was the official language of Rome, but the scholarly language was Greek, and that's what the New Testament was written in. So you got all these roads to travel to spread the gospel, and you got the Greek language. It was something almost everyone was familiar with everywhere in the Roman Empire and somewhat beyond. And so you could communicate the gospel about as good as you could. I mean, obviously they didn't have Zoom then, but that was the closest they had, to whatever. That was the closest they had to superhighways or telephones or whatever, the Greek language. So yes, God's divine providence played a major role. He worked through some of these world leaders and conquerors and empires, some of which were definitely evil even. He worked through them to establish the perfect time for his kingdom to be born, for the church to originate here on this earth. So it all works together. And if we look at verse 45, when he says, and he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas, the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end and no one will help him. Well, this is really summing up a few hundred years of Roman history in one verse. We know that when Jesus Christ was born, Judea was under Roman control. So, his tents, the area he controlled, extended into the glorious land, the holy land, the Bible land, the land of the Jews. And then when it says, yet no one will help him, well, eventually that would definitely be the case, regardless of which event you regard as the actual fall of Rome. They weren't getting any assistance from anybody at that point in time. They had lots of allies, but they didn't do them a bit of good. And once again, when I say they had lots of allies, if we go back to Daniel chapter 2 and verses 40 through 43, I think that is probably the best explanation of when it talks about the iron and clay mixed together in the feet of that great image that Nebuchadnezzar, that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about. So it talks about here, I'm going to just read this real quickly, starting in Daniel 2, verse 40. And the fourth kingdom, I think we pretty much know that's Rome, shall be as strong as iron, and as much as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. Well, it was a mighty empire. It definitely did that. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. So Rome had alliances with other countries. You could even count Egypt among them. You could count Herod among the allies of Rome. But what good did Egypt or Herod or anybody do them against the Gothic tribes, the Germanic tribes, and the Parthians down the road? So, I mean, in the long run, I mean, we're talking hundreds of years later, but this all fits. I hope this makes this even more clear, because it was harder, it's harder to picture this when we're back in Daniel chapter 2, because we don't go into as much detail about Rome. But here, when we're talking almost exclusively about Rome, I think it becomes much more apparent what this part of that image, because I think that's the most confusing part of Daniel 2, is those last few verses about the clay and the iron mixing together. Hopefully that clears that up some for you. Anybody have any take on that themselves or want to add anything to that? Okay. Okay. All right. You know what? We are through chapter 11, and I would love to jump into chapter 12, but I think we can cover that whole thing in 1 week. And if we start now, we're not going to have as much to cover next week. So I want to give you this sneak preview. Matt, if you could just put up that outline again, there's another page to that after the end of chapter 11. Just a beginning, there's just a few verses, okay, for Daniel 12 that I put some ideas down for. So I was thinking about just covering these first 4 verses and quitting there, okay, because it does relate to the Romans. But I'm just going to sneak preview it this way. And if you guys have questions or comments, we can move along. So it's about 7:51, and we usually get done 8:05 or so, but I think we'll get done before 8 regardless. But verses 1 through 3 of chapter 12, once again, it mentions Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble. Now, this time of trouble, I think what we're definitely getting at here is the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's why I've listed some of these verses for you here. They're not all in regard to the destruction of Jerusalem, but we have verses in Matthew 24, which we'll look at here momentarily. I guess real quickly, I can't resist. We got to use up a few minutes here and get a sneak preview. But in Ezekiel 5 and verses 8 through 9, we have similar language about Babylon that we have being used here in Daniel and in Matthew 24 that is in regard to Rome. So let's flip to Ezekiel chapter 5. And if somebody gets there before I do, feel free to go ahead and read those verses. Ezekiel chapter 5 and verses 8 through 9. So much for stopping there, huh? Okay. Okay, actually I have it. So it says, therefore, thus says the Lord God, indeed, even I, am against you and will execute judgments in your midst in the sight of the nations. And I will do among you what I have never done, and the like of which I will never do again because of all your abominations. Okay, so this language here, I think in Ezekiel chapter 5 and verses 8 and 9, this is talking about punishment of Judah when they're going to be carried off into Babylonian captivity. They're going to be struck down. And there's similar language as we look at Matthew chapter 24, and we'll just look at a few verses in Matthew 24. In fact, let's look at 21 first. I'm not going to take them in the actual order that they're there. Let's look at Matthew 24 and verse 21. And then secondly, let's look at verse, okay, they're right there. All right. Okay. What's right there. Okay. So I'm just going to read it off the screen. That's big. Won't even need my glasses for that. Okay. For then there will be, well, I can't see. Actually, I can't see. It's blocked out. Okay. I'll read it off the Bible. They said to him, oh, sorry. I've got the wrong page. Whoops. I missed. All right. 24:21. Wait a minute. Yes. 24:21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be. So this is similar language. And I'm talking to God's people about a punishment to come. And it's very similar to what he had told them prior to them being taken off into Babylon. Okay, now if we go then to verse, the next one I had listed, I believe was, what did I have listed there next after verse 21 in that outline? I thought it was 34. Yep, it was. Okay. 34, Matthew 24:34. I think this is very powerful, tying together the book of Daniel with what Jesus is saying here in Matthew 24:34. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Okay, this generation is living there. There are going to be some of you around to see this. When was Jesus speaking this? Probably around 29 AD, maybe 30, give or take, maybe a little later than that. 40 years later, roughly, this was going to happen. This was going to play out. These people that he was talking to, when he said, this generation shall not pass away, that means some of you are still going to be alive for this. I think that makes it very clear that this is not some kind of future event that's going to happen in the Middle East in the 21st century, basically. This is, I think, definitely narrowing it down to the destruction of Jerusalem. And also, if we look at verse 15 in the book of Matthew 20, in Matthew 24, verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, Whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay. Well, I love this because Jesus is endorsing Daniel. Jesus is legitimizing the book of Daniel. If he's not doing anything else here, that's what he's doing. And when he's talking about the abomination of desolation, it's something yet to come, because he's not talking about something that's happened. He says, when you see this, so it's going to come. And then we look in other verses, well, this generation won't pass away. It's going to happen before all of you are dead. At some point, some of you are going to see this. And then when he talks about what's going to happen, it all fits with the destruction of Jerusalem. And then when he says, when you see these things happening, okay, I definitely believe, I don't believe it's talking about the second coming either, because if he comes in the blink of a trumpet, we're all going to meet the Lord in the air, and, it's going to be bang, it's all going to be over with. You're not going to have time to flee anywhere when you see these things coming, because I know there are some that probably think this is not the destruction of Jerusalem. This is like the second coming of Christ, but I don't believe that at all, because when that happens, it's over. There's no, like, some of you, make sure when you see this, run for your lives. There's nowhere to run from God. So obviously you're running from someone that you can run from when you still have time. And this is before the Romans close in totally. And when you see the Romans, when they're surrounding the city, get out of there, because nobody's getting out eventually. And that's what they did. The Romans laid siege to Jerusalem for quite some time, and eventually starved out many of the people inside. And then once they moved in, they flattened it. So, when Jesus said, I tell you, there should not be one stone here that's on top of and laid upon another that will not be thrown down, that's exactly how the destruction of Jerusalem took place. So I guess for those first few verses in Daniel chapter 12, 1 through 3, I think we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then I'll leave you with this one. And once again, verse 4, compare what it says there in Daniel 12:4 to what it says in Revelation 22:10. And I think we've made this point before, but here it is again: the difference between sealing things up and not sealing them up as far as prophecies go. Okay, this Revelation, thanks, Matt, he put that up for us. And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. But here in Daniel, in chapter 12, verse 4, it specifically says, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Well, I think that's where I want to leave it with my comments for the day. But if anybody has questions or comments, and there's other things I left out, but we will definitely cover this in more detail next week, and Lord willing, finish off chapter 12 and the study. So what things does anybody have on their mind that you'd like to bring up one way or the other here before we call it a day? I covered it all that good?
We're dazzled. You did a great job.
Oh, really? Okay. I was hoping you confused us so much, we don't even know what to ask. I get that look once in a while. So I did occasionally, but okay. Christy's giving me a different look right now. Okay. All right. Well, I would say then that's a wrap for tonight, and we will plan, Lord willing, on covering all of chapter 12 in a little bit more detail next week, and finishing off the book and moving on from there. So